All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Jasmine Hall. I work for Early Hasidism as the Advocacy and Leadership Program Coordinator. I just want to take the time to thank Rabbi Ariel Mayse for being a part of this and for giving his talk. This is Book Talk, Laws of the Spirit. Ariel Evan Mayse is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Stanford University, the rabbi-in-residence at Atiq, Jewish Maker Institute, and Senior Scholar in Residence at the Institute of Jewish Spirituality and Society. Previously, he served as the Director of Jewish Studies and Visiting Assistant Professor of Modern Jewish Thought at Hebrew College in Newton, Massachusetts, and a Research Fellow at the Frankel Institute for Advanced Judaic Studies of the University of Michigan. Mayse holds a Ph.D. in Jewish Studies from Harvard University and a rabbinic ordination from Beit Midrash Har'el in Israel. He is the author of Laws of the Spirit, Ritual, Mysticism, and the Commandment in Early Hasidism, and Speaking Infinities, God and Language in the Teachings of Rabbi Dov of Mezritsh. His current book project, As a Deep River Rises, Judaism, Ecology and Environmental Ethics, is under contract with Brandeis University Press, and he has written a biography of the Baal Shem Tov for the Jewish Live series at Yale University Press. Very exciting to have him here today. Thank you so much, and go right ahead.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. I appreciate that very warm introduction. Thanks, Emma, for your help. Rav Shmuley, as always, thank you for not only this specific program, but for all that you do in the world. Such a great admirer of this organization, such a great admirer of your Torah and the work that you do. It's really nice also to see Reb Nachum Twersky here with us. Reb Nachum Twersky is one of my a supporter and a dear friend these decades now. It's wonderful to be able to say that, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Good to see you again. In what follows, I'm going to welcome you into a journey that in some ways is 4, 5, or 6 years old, and in some ways it is really a journey that goes back, I guess, also several decades, maybe 4. The book that I'm going to talk about today is really a reflection not only of my intellectual journey, it's certainly that, it's a reflection of my own personal journey, and in some ways I think it began in the martial arts practice of my youth. I trained in traditional Shotokan karate about among other different kinds of martial arts. And that was an extremely important and formative experience in my life. I had the good fortune of training with a teacher, with a sensei, who was not only a very gifted instructor in terms of the technicalities of karate, but also someone who understood the life of the spirit as essential to the work that karate does. And as a part of that, when we underwent black belt training, we were taught that everything we had done in the dojo, everything we had done in the karate school was great and very important, but we needed to be able to carry it out into the world. And what my teacher, Sensei Stuart Kwan, meant by that, I came to understand, was actually twofold. The first was quite literally, we had to carry it into the mountains of the Sierra Nevadas. If we did it in the dojo, we had to do it on top of a mountain. We had to do it in a river. We had to do it on an ice floe. We had to do it on a frozen log. And that was quite illuminating to see where it was that my body stopped and my energy carried me forward. But what Sensei Stuart, my teacher, also meant was that when we carry karate out into the world, we are bringing it into our daily lives. So when we fold up the gi, when we fold up our uniform, and we go into line at the marketplace, or we walk down the street, anything that we are doing, we do that as a practitioner of martial arts whose being is suffused by that practice. One of the things that this taught me was that embodied practices, the way that we move our hands and our feet and our actions in this world, are expressions of our highest ideas and ideals. And moreover, from that experience of black belt training and the test in the middle of the mountains, I realized that there is something much bigger than my own life and my own spirit that connects me to something much more infinite. I went to college at UC Davis and then studied with David Beale of blessed memory, who was a remarkable historian of Jewish culture, a remarkable thinker, and an incredible teacher. And in one of the first classes that I took with him, in fact, the very first class that I took with him during my freshman year, there was one class on Hasidism. And I remember quite vividly the fireworks going off in my mind. Because in the teachings of Hasidism, for the first time, I found a spiritual vocabulary from my own tradition that underscored what I knew to be true from my own experience. I'll flash forward a little bit to my Ph.D. program, where after 5 years of having sat at the feet of David Beale and having learned how to read Hasidic sources in the original, I had the good fortune of doing a Ph.D. with Arthur Green and was initiated into the world of the scholarship on Hasidism. And I was reading quite deeply the works of Gershom Scholem and Martin Buber, two of the greatest researchers of the Hasidic movement, both of whom spent a great deal of time seeking to understand this explosion of mystical piety in the 18th century, which took hold and took root in such deep ways in the landscape of Jewish culture in Eastern Europe, throughout Podolia, throughout southern Ukraine, and really from there into what we now call Poland and all the way up into Lithuania, leaving an enormous imprint on all of Yiddish-speaking Jewry up until the time of the Holocaust. And then, of course, it changed dramatically in its reconstitution after the Shoah, taking on new forms in America and in Israel, and I'm happy to speak more about that, but it's not our subject for now. Buber and Scholem, Martin Buber, the great philosopher, Gershom Scholem, the great philologist, the scholar of manuscripts, the scholar of Jewish culture, and the scholar of Jewish mystical traditions, and really all things mystical, disagreed in their scholarship on Hasidism pretty much diametrically. They took the opposite approach in almost every way. Whereas Martin Buber felt that the stories that the Hasidim told about themselves and about their leaders were really the key to understanding the vitality of this religious movement, Gershom Scholem said, no, it's the theoretical texts that really matter. That's where the action really takes place. Buber understood this worldly engagement rather than a kind of yearning for mystical transcendence to be the essence of Hasidism. And for Scholem, guess what? It was the exact opposite. For Buber, a kind of joyous embrace of conviviality, of human sociality. For Scholem, it was the retreat into the inner depths of the soul that really characterized Hasidic yearnings for the divine. And we could go on in drawing their contradistinctions. And yet, what was so interesting is that they actually agreed on one point. And that is that Hasidism is, by its very nature, essentially a kind of anarchic religious movement, a mystical movement that pulls at the boundaries of halacha, of Jewish law, of Jewish convention, of Jewish practice, and seeks, in fact, to destroy them, if implicitly. The yearning of Hasidism is for spiritual uplift, but the law is what drags us down. Both Buber and Scholem describe it as a wonder, a kind of miracle in the history of religion, that Hasidism remained within the boundaries of orthodoxy. I already at the time that I was a graduate student, and certainly decades later, a decade later after I was done with my graduate degree, didn't see a way in which their readings of Hasidism matched the sources. In fact, to me, it seemed like the sources said exactly the opposite than what these titans of the field argued. And so I went in search of new ways of thinking such that I'd be able to answer this question: how is it that Hasidism gives into the world an ability to be at the same time committed to religious obligation and tradition on the one hand, and on the other hand, to be entirely committed to joyous devotion, ecstatic yearning for God, and a kind of continuous push toward creativity? How is it that the single cultural mind, the single heart, can hold both of those things which feel like they are fundamentally at odds with one another? Now, here's a picture of the book. So many of life's great moments are really serendipitous. Sometimes it's that we walk into a bookstore and we find a book that we never knew existed, and all of a sudden our horizons open and something is transformed. In my case, it was both books and also conversations really made this possible for me. I had a conversation once with Alan Brill, who was a great scholar of Kabbalah, a great scholar of rabbinic Judaism in general, of Jewish thought and philosophy. And I said, you know, Alan, I really want to write a book about Hasidism and halacha. And Alan, who has a way with words, says, that's a terrible idea. Why would you do that? And I thought to myself, okay, thanks, Alan. Tell me what you really think. And he then went on and he said, why would you write about halacha? It's the misnagdim, the opponents of Hasidism, who really believe in halacha. The Hasidim are committed to something else. They believe in Torah u'mitzvot, Torah and the commandments. And I sat and I thought about what Alan might be pointing me towards for some number of months, and then I realized it. When the word halacha, when the word law, and we'll talk about that translation, which I think is quite an impoverished one, is used in Hasidic sources, it's never in reference to the kind of halachic or legal discourse that you find in other kinds of Jewish literature. What they use it to refer to is the mores or the customs of Jewish life. Sometimes they describe it as, in homiletic terms, as the way that we walk, halacha, the way that we walk to stand in God's presence at all times. One famous homiletical interpretation reads halacha as an acronym for Hariu Ladonai Kol Haaretz. All of the world calls out with divinity. That's a very different way of thinking about halacha than some kind of formalistic or positivistic or purist way that you find in many other texts. So I thought to myself, then I need to bark up a different tree. So I had a conversation with a colleague of mine, Eli Stern, who teaches at Yale, and he had this offhand moment where he says, you know, I think they're not really considering the mitzvot as law, they're considering the mitzvot within the category of ritual. And he walked off. And again, fireworks. And I ran to my friend who's an anthropologist, and I said, where can I find a discourse on ritual that helps me understand the questions that I'm asking? And so my friend, Tanya Luhrmann, who is a very good anthropologist of religion, a very fine scholar, pointed me toward a way of thinking about ritual in which, if there are three different schools of ritual studies, there's one in which ritual is understood as something that religious people or non-religious people, we all do ritual, do as a kind of thoughtless gesture. Why do we do it? Because our parents did it. Oh, because our community does it. What does it mean? Who knows? A second school of ritual studies is that it's all about the symbols. When we do one thing, we're actually pointing toward a symbolic network of associations that's much bigger. Okay, also good. But there's a third school of ritual studies, of the academic study of ritual, that has been very important in my own thinking, and that is that ritual is a way that we make sense of our world. It's a way that we make sense of our lives. And in fact, it's a way that we think. So embedded in this is actually a very significant philosophical argument against a kind of dualistic problem, or a dualistic perspective in which we believe that the mind and the body are two unlinked, two fundamentally divested realms of human experience. Ritual studies reminds us that sometimes we think with our brain, for sure, but we also think with the work of our hands in this world. And we think through ritual. And so ritual is a place for our minds to wander and to wonder and to open up new pathways of thinking, and sometimes to arrive at some kind of what we might call embodied or somatic knowledge. And it was diving deeply into that I realized, oh, Hasidic thinkers aren't thinking about the commandments purely in terms of obligations, although they are obligatory. They're thinking about them as technologies or techniques of presence, of ways of stitching together body and mind, heart and world, self and other. And they're ways that we think. They're ways that we conjure up an experience of divine presence, even when we feel like we live in a world of divine absence. And in other words, they're ways that we make God's presence real in the minds and bodies of practitioners. And in that moment, once I came to see that, everything fell into alignment. Here before you, I've given you just a kind of overview of what the book covers. There's a chapter about the way that we think through ritual, the way that actions are not directed by the mind, or at least not always or exclusively directed by the minds, but through actions we come to think, which is not just a kind of, oh, fake it till you make it type perspective, but an understanding that through writing we discover, through acting we learn. The second chapter has to do with Torah study, not simply as an intellectual activity that takes place within the inner recesses of the mind, but one that involves affect, the emotions, and body as well. Hasidic descriptions of Torah study really drip with descriptions of the way that those who are studying ought to, or in historical terms, really did become overwhelmed by the experience of God's presence through the light of the letters, through engaging with the sources. And it's meant not only to echo and reverberate within the mind, but the knowledge that one gains through that experience of Torah study is meant to transform, illuminate. They often use this kind of light-based metaphor, illuminate the body in a way that changes the way that we are in the world. Another thing, and this is the central motif of the third chapter, another element that I gained from ritual studies is that while it's sometimes argued that ritual is by its very nature something that we do only occasionally, that was a common argument in the 19th and early 20th centuries, it's since been proven, and I think it's right, at least in my own experience, that even for non-religious people, but certainly for religious people, ritual is an everyday food. It's an all-the-time food. It's something that we're doing all the time. There are rituals to everything from courthouses to musical concerts to writing to how you get on and stay on a Zoom call. We have our own rituals, even though we sometimes don't refer to them with that word. One of the cornerstones, you might say one of the cardinal elements of Hasidic theology, is that if every moment can be transformed into a sacred encounter with God, so too every action can be transformed into a sacred encounter with the divine. And if that's the case, it means that the canonical mitzvot, or the commandments that guide Jewish life and living, are only a part of that story. In philosophical terms, we might say they are necessary but not sufficient. You need them, but they're not the end of the story. They are essential but not exhaustive. And ritual gives us a way of thinking about the way that eating, ordinary conversations, all types of human activity, or what Heidegger calls being in the world, are ways of serving God, not because they threaten the importance of the commandments, but because they stretch the capacity of sacred living to encompass all elements of human activity. The fourth chapter is about the power of the commandments to spark and continue the process of revelation that in some sense began at Mount Sinai, but according to the Kabbalistic, the Hasidic imagination, revelation really begins with the moment in which God creates the world, or even the moments before God creates the world, as God breaks the chains of silence and enters into the world such that God may be known by the world. And that's the beginning of revelation that reaches a new peak at the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. But Hasidic sources pretty much univocally argue that revelation never ended. It continues for those who have attentive minds and open hearts. The commandments, say these sources, are techniques, technologies for making ourselves aware that God's revelation transpires in every moment. That's a threatening idea and a little bit frightening for some. And the fifth chapter takes up that question. If there's anything that most people know about Rabbinic Judaism, it's that Rabbinic Judaism chooses not to follow private revelation as a kind of religious authority, and rather we look to text, which is not necessarily the case, and in fact sometimes is not the case in Hasidic sources. You look to a text to know what to do, but only in vague terms, whether that's a legal text or a theological text. The importance of the written word shrinks back before the importance of listening to the divine will or the divine unfolding in one's own heart and mind. And this is what might be called a kind of yearning for authenticity, not autonomy as it comes to be in the classical modern sense, but a yearning to align one's own wish to serve God with the divine will, which is never finished unfolding. And that means that the only place you can turn to know truly what it is that God wishes from you at any moment is inward. That has significant implications for community, since you have to also justify how you live in a matrix of practice with others. And also there are interesting questions about leadership. Who has the authority? Is it everyone? Is it only certain religious figures? If it's everyone, that's destabilizing, while also being democratic. If it's just leaders, or certain kinds of leaders, that's certainly stabilizing, but it also leads into a kind of both autocracy on the one hand, and on the other, it allows us to off-site or offshore our own religious work and to say someone else will let me know what to do. Hasidic sources go in both of those directions, and I think they try to maintain that tension rather than fully resolve it. And the last two chapters look at interesting phenomena, or at least interesting to me. One is that Hasidic sources are so deeply aware that two different legal authorities or two different scholars or even two different human beings can look at the same text or the same practice and interpret it in very, very different ways. And that interpretation might mean nothing about the actual text or the actual practice changes. I'm just I'm understanding different meaning behind it. It might also mean, and they're very forthright about this, that the dimensions of practice, the way that people do being Jewish in our modern parlance, actually looks very different in very different times and places. In one Hasidic text, they compare this to the way that an eagle takes flight and then sheds its feathers and has to regrow them, and then sheds its feathers and has to regrow them. So too, says this text, we take flight by practicing a certain way, but that doesn't hold us aloft forever. And so we have to land, ground ourselves, and find a new way of serving God, because more important than just following the dictates of tradition is finding that sense of vitality, newness, and sincerity. I'm, I'm kind of not sure whether or not they actually mean an eagle. Eagles do this really interesting thing that some birds do where they molt a lot of feathers all at once. And certain species have this thing called catastrophic molting, where they molt all at once and they can't fly anymore. Not eagles, but other birds do this. And it's interesting that those birds and those species that undergo this process of catastrophic molting are the ones with the strongest social dynamics, the strongest social connections. Why? Because in those moments of change and transformation, you really need others to help you. It's a beautiful lesson from the world of biology for thinking about the way that we are held by others in our own religious lives. The other obvious option is that they're not talking about an eagle at all. It's actually an elliptical reference to a phoenix, the bird that arises from the ashes and then collapses back into fire and is then reborn. And that, says this source, is the way that we ought to think about our own religious life, that flames up and then retracts and then takes flight once more. The final chapter of the book examines two very odd, at least on the face of it, rabbinic teachings. One is that the biblical heroes, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, and Rachel, observe the commandments before they were given, which seems totally nonsensical. How could they observe the commandments before Sinai? Many answers are advanced. One of the ones that I pay particular attention to in this book is a vision of these biblical figures looking into their very selves, and from that knowing what God asks from them. So the Torah is not given, but they seek to serve God through the commandments, as it were, through a kind of self-knowledge that predates revelation. And of course, revelation didn't start with Mount Sinai, but began with the works of creation. And so they're able to do this kind of introspective contemplative work and thus come to know God. The second part of this chapter, or the second part of this rabbinic story, I think, even though the actual dicta are not related in the Talmud, is a statement in the end of one of the Talmudic tractates that says that the mitzvot betelot la'atid lavo, that the commandments will be nullified in the time to come. That's something that really sets off people's hackles, right? How can it be that the commandments are going to be annulled? If there's anything that's cornerstone of traditional Jewish practice, it's commitment to the mitzvot. It's commitment to the commandments. And there are certainly Hasidic sources that say, while the commandments will be abjured, they will be nullified in the world to come. It's not that the actions themselves will be nullified. It's that the command will be nullified, and we will seek to serve God in all of these ways simply through, again, the kind of introspective knowledge, but out of love. So rather than this kind of structure of whether it's reward and punishment, or it is simply just command and obedience, we will follow the divine precepts purely out of connection and purely out of love. There are others that say, yeah, they're kind of over because we don't need them anymore. We'll live with a consciousness of divinity before us at all times. Both of these, in the past, in the future, might be understood purely as retrospections or anticipations of the time to come, retrojections into the past or anticipations into the future. On the other hand, anytime religious thinkers talk about what happened long ago or what might happen in the future, they're also suggesting something about the possibilities in the present. And I think that's where the daring element of those texts comes forward. If in the future we are to serve God purely out of love, there's some element of that that is true of the present. And if there is something about the past in which we serve God through understanding divine being, through our own lives, bodies, and revelations, then it's not simply because it's inscribed in a text that we worship, it's because it's enshrined in our bodies. I'm just going to pause here for 1 second, and then I've got some texts, you don't have to take my word for it, and see if there are any questions from those who are here about what I've said thus far. Otherwise, I'll be forced to barrel on. Jasmine or Emma, let me know if something comes in the chat. Otherwise, I'm gonna scoot forward. So there's never enough time in a 1-hour presentation to talk about everything that I want to talk about. So I want to just give you a few moments in this book that these are texts that I think demonstrate the kind of fundamental religious shifts that we're talking about. One of them, which you have in front of you now, is a text attributed to the Baal Shem Tov by his disciple, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya. The Baal Shem Tov, the putative founder of Hasidism, although he doesn't set out to found any kind of religious movement, is definitely, in my eyes, correctly understood as being the person whose theological legacy sets into motion the conversation that becomes Hasidism. So he stands at the heart of it, even if he doesn't stand at the helm of it, right? He's not saying, oh, you go here and you're going to set up this synagogue and you're going to do this, and oh, isn't it great that we're founding a new religious movement? I think that's all hopelessly anachronistic. But there is something about an axial shift that happens with the Baal Shem Tov, which I think you see already in this text. So Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya, his disciple, his close follower, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya, who was also a rabbi in the town of Shargorod, probably met the Baal Shem Tov at some point in the late 1740s, 47, 48, and despite the fact that he came from a scholastic, not just scholarly, but really scholastic in the sense of far removed from the ordinary life of ordinary people, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya was totally transformed by that encounter. One of the stories that describes their first meeting, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya goes and he meets the Baal Shem Tov, and he's not exactly overwhelmed by this person's gravitas or his scholarly acumen. But then when they begin to pray, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya is overcome by weeping. He's overcome by this moment of profound transcendence. And then he says, and I realized that the weeping was not my own. When I was in the black belt test on these mountains, I had this moment where I understood what it meant to be breathed by a mountain. And I think Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya understood what it is to be cried, right? I don't even know how you would say that in English, but there's something that passes through him. In any event, two of the teachings that we're going to look at, again, even if only in brief today, from Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya, are texts from the Baal Shem Tov that he cites not once, and not twice, and actually not 3 times, but dozens of times. And that means one of two things, in my opinion. Either it means that the Baal Shem Tov said this all the time. It's certainly a possibility. Or, and I think this is really it, the Baal Shem Tov said it once or twice, and that was it. It was electrifying for Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya. We've all read a book where no matter what conversation we're having, after having read it, we bring that book into the conversation. Oh, did you read this book that has nothing to do with that? But I'm thinking about it all the time. And it's kind of like that. Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya drops this text or this teaching in whenever he possibly can. And we'll look at another one like that in just a moment. Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya says as follows: I heard my teacher give an interpretation of the verse from the book of Ecclesiastes, Kol asher timsa yadcha la'asot bekochacha aseh ki ein b'she'ol dat v'cheshbon. All that comes to your hand to do, do it with power, because in the netherworld there is neither awareness nor account. The plain sense or the obvious meaning of that passage from the book of Ecclesiastes might be something like, whatever you can do, you should hold on to it and do it with vim and with vigor, because in the hell to which we are all going, there's no accounting. Enjoy this life, because it is the only world that really counts. The book of Ecclesiastes has multiple conflicting messages, but this kind of materialist, not in the contemporary sense, but in the sense of embracing the material as the primary plane of human life rather than the spiritual, is one of the elements of the book of Ecclesiastes. But you'll see that it's going to go in a very different direction when the Baal Shem Tov gets his hands on this teaching. He then quotes an seemingly unrelated passage talking about Hanoch, talking about Enoch, a biblical hero who, according to the book of Genesis, has two enormous claims to fame. One, he walks with God, and two, that's it. He's gone. He doesn't die. He doesn't go up even in a fiery chariot. He just disappears. Ancient Jewish teachings, and ancient Christian teachings, in fact, and ancient Gnostic teachings seek to understand, so what's so special about Enoch, who becomes, as the text here says, becomes turned into an angel after not his death, but his disappearance from this worldly existence. Many of them describe him going on these kind of heavenly journeys in which the entire celestial realm opens up before him, and he gazes upon not just the stars, but upon the maps of divinity and understands how all things shape up. One of the medieval versions of that brings Enoch back down to earth and says, you know what? You're right. He was an angel. And how did he become an angel? Because he was first and foremost a shoemaker. He is a cobbler, and who haya me'ached kudsha brichu shchinte al kol tfira. He would unify the Blessed Holy One and Shekhinah, the masculine and feminine, the transcendent and immanent elements of the divine. He would stitch them together in everything that he did. So you can just see the Hasidic imagination beginning to run wild with this, but they don't have to take it very far. The text says almost everything that they need it to. So here you have Enoch, biblical protagonist in a minor key, right? He only has a couple of verses, who then becomes celebrated in post-biblical texts. But what's his significance? Why is he so special? He's an ordinary cobbler with an extraordinary capacity for intention, such that when he brings together the broken parts of the shoe, or when he brings together the unmade, unmolded parts of the shoe, he unites heaven and earth. So the Baal Shem Tov then takes that in a slightly different direction by pointing out that we have, and I'm going to paraphrase here, you have the text in front of me and you can check to see if you think what I'm saying is what the text says. We have within our planes of experience two very important different realms. One of them is machshava or machashava, thought, and the other is ma'aseh. Machshava and ma'aseh, thought and action, contemplation and deed. One of those, says the Baal Shem Tov, is infinite. Literally, infinite because thought never ceases so long as we are alive. But of course, Ein Sof is one of the names of God. Ma'aseh, action, is limited, it's concrete, it is connective. It's about this worldly engagement, and that is Shekhinah. That is the realm of God's presence that touches down in the world. That is the way that God dwells in the world. Shekhinah, from the word to dwell, also Mishkan, the tabernacle that's built and dragged around in the wilderness where God's presence comes to bear. So here, says the Baal Shem Tov, you have a world of infinity and you have a world of concreteness. That's the world of the mind and the world of the body. That's the world of the contemplative soul, and that's the world of physical action. And here's one of the key lines. Ka'asher mechaber ha'ma'aseh im ha'machshava ba'et asiyat ha'ma'aseh nikra yichud kudsha b'richu u'shchente. And when one connects action with thought, when that action is being carried out, this, says the Baal Shem Tov, is what it means to unite the broken elements of the divine. Those different elements, the immanent and the transcendent, heaven and earth, inner, outer, all of it is getting, and you'll forgive me, stitched together. And you can just hear this in the Hebrew. The emphasis on this worldly action. Ka'asher mechaber ha'ma'aseh, action. Im ha'machshava be'et asiyat ha'ma'aseh. And I mean, in a sort of crass translation, it would be, and when one binds the action with one's thought, when one is actioning that action, right? The activity here of the physicality of it is of cardinal importance. That, he says, is drawing together the God above and the God within. This is both totally contiguous with Kabbalistic traditions that understand the commandments as having this power, but here, just look at the text. We're not talking about a commandment. We're talking about the way that human beings are in this world, or at least potentially. This, says the Baal Shem Tov, is the secret meaning or the deeper meaning of the verse in Ecclesiastes. So all that is in your hand to do, kol asher timsa yadcha la'asot bekochacha aseh. Anything that your hand holds on to doing, any of your physical actions in this world, any moments or opportunity for work, what the philosopher Merleau-Ponty will call body work or hand techniques, anything that you have in this world, whether it's knitting and shoemaking, to helping other human beings, whatever it might be, bekochacha aseh. Unite that infinite quality within yourself. Ground that infinity in the being, in the action, in the concreteness of that deed. So you bring the realm of thought into the realm of action, and thus transform both of them, uniting divinity. And here, my friends, is the fasten your seatbelt moment. So watch how he totally inverts what we had thought might be the plain sense meaning of the text. Ein b'sheol dat b'cheshbon. There's no accounting in hell where we are all going. So then he says Sheol might be related to the word she'elah. Hell, or the netherworld, better, because I think it's unburdened by those associations that we have with hell, this place of eternal repose. I think that's what it means for, or at least post-worldly repose. That's what it means for the book of Ecclesiastes. Here he means, if he relates it to the word shelah, which means question, and he argues as follows. If you question in some fundamental capacity, not like, oh, I have a question, how do I do this? But if you deny the human capacity for stitching together heaven and earth, immanent and transcendent, my life with my physical life with my inner life, and by the way, my life and the life of other human beings, if you deny that, then you live in a world without da'at, without awareness. You might say without mindfulness. You live in a world without cheshbon, a sense of carefulness and accounting, of calculated engagement with this world, calculated in the positive sense, not in the negative sense. And so where do you end up? In a kind of self-created hell, in which there is no meaning, in which there is no deeper connection to yourself or to others. You stare into the abyss, and you enter it rather than walking across it. So much to say about Nietzsche, so much to say about the 20th century existentialists, but I'll table all that for now. What does this have to do with other people? I've said that several times in this text. And I want to draw us to, this source, which is the other passage that Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnaya constantly and consistently reiterates in the name of the Baal Shem Tov. He quotes a Talmudic teaching in which one rabbi asks another, they're hanging out in the marketplace, evidently. You can just imagine them at Market Basket. I don't know what the major market in Phoenix is. It's Berkeley Bowl here in Berkeley, where I live. And they say, Kroger's, whatever. Is there anyone here who's worthy of the world to come? And the one rabbi says to the other, oh, yeah, for sure. Those two clowns over there. That's it. That's the end of the Talmudic story. And almost no one talks about this. It's in the third chapter of the book of the Talmudic tractate Ta'anit, which doesn't get a lot of airtime in rabbinic sources or in post-rabbinic literature because it's really kind of oddball legends, which is why it's so interesting to the Hasidic imagination. They love that. They love that chapter. So the Baal Shem Tov cites this, but he also was evidently as confused about it as most of us might be. And so he says, I'm going to figure out what to do by dreaming. Dreaming, of course, in the psychoanalytic imagination, like in the Hasidic imagination, is a time of thinking. Sleep is far from passive. Sleep is a time for dreams, and dreams are the way that we process our world and the way that we make narratives about our world. So he asks a question about it and then goes to sleep. This is an old tradition called the She'ilat Chalom. And he discovers an answer. These two clowns, the word Bad Chai can also mean merrymakers, it can mean jesters, and it can also mean fools. Fools in the Shakespearean sense of those who have a capacity to speak truth to power that would get other people into trouble, and who have a kind of bird's eye vision of this world and how things will unfold and what one ought to do that even those who are the so-called power brokers don't have. Think about fools in the history of tragedies and comedies, and you'll see what I mean. And so, says the Baal Shem Tov, what's so special about these merrymakers, these barchanim? They are totally devoted to connecting with other people in each and every moment, in each and every place, in everything that they do, at home and in business, in general, in specific, in each and every moment, they seek out connection. Okay, great. What makes it so special that they're merrymakers? That's where he continues and goes a little bit further. And he says, it's specifically the fact that they connect through humor, and specifically the fact that they connect through good cheer that allows them to do this. And when they come up against someone who is sunken in melancholy and despondency, they cheer that person up, such that that person can also find access to joy. And they become attached to that person. And through that person, the merrymakers, both become united with each other and in God. Let me tell you what I don't think this text is about. It's not about someone who is clinically depressed. It's also not about squeezing out someone's need to feel deep, big, and sometimes complicated feelings. But what I do think this text is about is the capacity that takes enormous spiritual strength and enormous reserves and really a deep well of inner optimism to stay with the trouble, to use the environmental philosopher Donna Harrison's term, to stay with the trouble and to help other people find access to alternative futures or alternative possibilities, to absorb that sadness, to hold on to it, and to help them find a way out of it. It can be the gift of a joke. It can be the gift of material assistance. It can be the gift of a smile. It can be any of those things. But it is not to turn aside from those in need. It is not to turn aside from those who are reaching out to you, or who are not even reaching out, but are shrunken back and told that they are on the margins of the world. And here I think the Baal Shem Tov has put a very strong social ethic forward. If you wish to see God, you see God in the face of the people around you. And that's not simply the people who are in the synagogue with you. It's not simply the people who are kind of like you. In fact, it's precisely those others, the people who are pushed away from the center. It's precisely there, says the Baal Shem Tov, that we go to find revelation. It brings to mind that famous Talmudic passage about the Messiah at the gates of Rome, binding the wounds of the lepers. And so many of the visions of care and so many of the visions of social responsibility that we have within the Jewish tradition here are given not only a kind of moral imperative behind them, but a profound theological and spiritual underpinning. You owe this to the people around you, and the yearning to stand in God's presence comes by no means at the expense of others, but precisely through connection with them. And I think I'll close with a very simple, but I find very compelling teaching from the Baal Shem Tov. It's nowhere attested other than this one passage, which might mean that it's made up. But this is a very early source, and it's so odd and so different, I think it's got to be true. It's someone who knew the disciples of the Baal Shem Tov who had met him, and is in a place, I think, to quote second-hand traditions in a first-hand way, if that makes sense, right? He's right there in the limelight of early Hasidism, and he says, we have many different intentions or many different kavanot that the Baal Shem Tov is said to have given for what we might think about during the blowing of the shofar, and this is one of them. He would stand in front of his community, or stand in front of those who were assembled, and he would say 3 words, but he would say them in different permutations. Ich und Eich und Gott. He said this in Yiddish so that people should understand it. You and I and God. And God and you and me and you and God. And this would repeat time after time after time after time. And if Martin Buber reminds us of the power of standing in front of others, and the great Emanuel Levinas, the Jewish philosopher, who perhaps more than others, any others of the 20th century, underscored the necessity of a kind of interpersonal obligation that lays claims upon us just by encountering others, the Baal Shem Tov reminds us, as both Buber and Levinas do in their own way, that that's not simply a moral or ethical obligation. It is by dint of our commitments to other human beings that we stand in God's presence. And I think it's not an accident that it's about the shofar. On the one hand, the shofar is the sound that has no words. It's something that reaches deep into our psyche. It's also the sound of a child who cries, who yearns for nothing more than connection and help. And I also like to think, and perhaps this is my own homiletical addition, the shofar is what is blown that brings down the walls of Jericho in the book of Joshua. And rather than understanding that as a kind of nationalistic conquest, I understand that here in personal terms. The blowing of the shofar brings down the walls that separate us from other human beings. Those perceived walls that say, I am I, and you are you, and God is God, and remind us that you and I and God and you and me and you and God are so deeply inter-included with one another that to help you is to help God, and to worship God is to help you. I think I want to pause there. I'm going to open up if there are any other questions or comments. Otherwise, I know that many people will be watching this asynchronously and will find this at a different time. I'm, for better or for worse, easy to find online. My email address is on the Stanford Jewish Studies website. It might be appended to this as well. One of my commitments is that if I've shown a slide or if I've talked about a text, or if I've put a text in someone's hands and I haven't talked about it, I'm always welcome. I'm always open to conversation. And if you'd like to follow up, please do so. The social ethic here, which I've tried to articulate in historical terms, is one that I think has profound resonances for our contemporary lives. It's one that I can only seek to live out in my own, but it is, I would venture to say, an animating principle behind the incredible work that Uri Letzedek and the team there does. So I close again with words of thank you for the kind offer to come and think with you, and gratitude for the work that you do in the world.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to tell us more about your book and about just the driving force behind all of the learning that you do. It was really enlightening to hear more about the spiritual aspects of Judaism in that way. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to send them to Rabbi Mayse or to send them in the chat. And yeah, thank you all so much for being here, and we hope to see you at a future time.